This podcast is brought to you by the Academy Veteran Bond ETF, ticker VETZ. That's VETZ VETZ, an exchange-traded fund focused on investing in mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities that support veteran lending. VETZ invests in residential mortgage loans to active duty service members and veterans, as well as loans to veteran-owned small businesses. To learn more, please visit academyetfs.com or contact your financial advisor. The Academy Veteran Bond ETF is managed by Academy Asset Management, the asset management affiliate of Academy Securities. Academy Securities is a registered broker-dealer. This podcast was recorded on June 25th, 2026. Brett Lowry is the moderator for this episode, introducing the panel and leading the discussion.
Welcome to our latest Academy Securities Geopolitical and Macro Strategy podcast. I'm your moderator, Brett Lowry, Head of Special Situations here at Academy Securities. Today I'm joined by Admiral Sarah Joyner, Admiral Trey Whitworth, and Maria Donnelly from our Geopolitical Intelligence Group, and Peter Chur, our Head of Macro Strategy here at Academy Securities as well. On this podcast, we'll cover several topics as we go around the world and provide a perspective on the following situations that we are monitoring. First, we'll provide an update on Iran as talks with the U.S. continue in Switzerland. The key topic is Iran's nuclear program, but we are a long way away from a final agreement, and fighting in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel could be one of the spoilers. We'll also address Cuba. As the economy continues to deteriorate, the situation is reaching a critical stage. As expected, something has to give, and Mexico is pushing to allow for more fuel shipments, and China has been delivering humanitarian assistance. However, Cuba has been introducing free market reforms, which could buy the regime some more time before the changes that the U.S. has been pressing for come to fruition. Next, we'll provide an update on the war in Ukraine. With the war raging on, Ukraine is seeing some success in its long-range strikes using its own technology. The drone attacks on Moscow's refinery and into Crimea are starting to have an impact on Russian fuel supplies and logistics. The G7 meeting in France was overshadowed by the Iran MOU signing, but once that was done, Trump turned his attention to Ukraine. However, the next push will likely be on the EU to help drive a resolution to the conflict. Finally, we addressed the recent economic tensions between the U.S. and China. Earlier this month, the Pentagon added roughly 24 companies to its list of Chinese businesses identified as aiding Beijing's military. In response this week, China imposed trade restrictions on dozens of U.S. entities, including 2 producers of rare earth minerals. To set the table in Iran, I will now turn it over to Admiral Joyner, who recently completed 36 years of service in the Navy, most recently as Director of Force Structure, Resources, and Assessment on the Joint Staff. Ma'am, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Brett. It's a pleasure to be here today. With the Iran situation at this point, as the MOU attempts to move forward, I think the biggest thing is that the real negotiations have stalled somewhat because we still can't establish the peace that's needed between the Palestinian Hezbollah actions and Israel. So that really serves Iran's current status is to delay and to exercise control over the straits. So we continue to see, as the MOU negotiations try to move forward, that this disruption will continue. The straits will continue to not be open to the movements that need to happen. So the shipping is still well below what it needs. We still have tankers stranded inside the straits, and the flow has really trickled down and remains at a low from what it needs to be, which is about at least 100 ships of various types a day going through the straits. So this all serves in the position of Iran to exercise control, to show that they really are the power player in this particular agreement. They are establishing the delay that they want, which allows them to continue to demonstrate that they are the true winners of this particular conflict. I said on the U.S. side, as we go forward, we had a few things that we really were focused on, which was controlling the Iranians' access to nuclear material and their nuclear program, exercising control of the straits, and making sure that they are open for free and open trade, and really a reduction in the overall arsenal and the aggression against the neighbors. As we look at the MOU moving forward, I think we're continuing to see conflicts arise. We're seeing the Iranians launching strikes over into Israel. We see Israel continuing to maintain its presence in Lebanon, and we continue to see Hezbollah and Israel in conflict with each other. So this is really stalling out and making very difficult conditions for any type of negotiations as we move forward. The biggest thing I think for the United States as we look at this is really getting in to take a look at that nuclear program and establishing controls on nuclear material, establishing real controls and a real understanding of what the status of the nuclear program is, reestablishing the inspections that need to be put in place, and having some level of more control than we've had historically with the JICPOA over how those inspections are done. So that's a key, I think, focus. I think as we look at what the United States is really focusing on is really, it's down to two things, which is that free flow of energy through the straits and commerce reestablished, and allowing that in a way that doesn't advantage Iran or any other country in the area, and then also getting control of that nuclear program. These are all potentials. I think it's going to be continue to be a very challenging situation with Israel and Lebanon as they move forward. And I think we'll continue to see the disruptions to the negotiations as we move forward. This may mean that the 60 days really extends farther, and really to get at this to an agreement that is binding. I think we're going to have to make sure that we are able to really bring home the negotiations during this time. So it's very fragile. I don't think it's on as firm a ground as what we would want it to be, and I think it continues to be a challenging situation for the United States in these negotiations as they move forward. So we're not in a legally binding agreement. We really continue to have a at-will process that people are willing to come together, and really it leaves the United States really one functioning lever to pull, which is POTUS reinitiating hostilities, which is probably, in many reasons, something that we are trying to avoid at this point. And
sustainable. I think
that
also
while that is
you will
punishing,
see
it
some
doesn't appear to be
dramatic
decisive for
conversations
the
about
Iranians
replenishing our
as we look
stockpiles,
at how
our
this moves
ability
forward.
to
No, thank
conduct
you, Sarah.
another
And
epic
Maria, I'll pass it over to you for
Fury-like
some of your thoughts
operation,
as well.
a
I mean, with the
sustained
MOU
engagement,
signing,
not just
as Sarah
through
mentioned,
the
we
air,
obviously don't
but
have a
through
definitive
multiple
deal just
means
yet. You know, the
of
next 60
applying
days will
pressure.
be telling.
How do
With
we
the first
address
round of
that? What are
talks
the
just finished
lessons
up in
learned
Switzerland,
moving
nuclear
forward?
program being number
And
one. Some
I
of your
think what
thoughts
we're going
on
to have
where
to
you think we
do
could go, the
is
nuclear
we
inspectors
have to
being allowed back
maintain
in the
some
country,
type
but you know, obviously a
of
lot of things left
discussion
out of
about
the
what a
MOU that we'll have
military
to cover
presence looks like
eventually.
in
But
order to
right now, with the nuclear
maintain
program
a
being number
presence
one.
to
But some of your
apply
thoughts on where we
pressure,
go from here.
because we have to assume with
Thanks, Brett,
certainty
and
that
thank you,
Iran
Sarah. I
will
mean, I think
violate
that
the
one of the
terms of the
biggest things
agreement,
that
whatever they
we
look
all
like.
have to pay attention to
Back to you, Brett.
is what, like,
No,
it's the
thank you.
devil in the
So I
details,
really
and I know that's
appreciate a
such a
wonderful
cliche,
overview
but
of where
what are
we
those
are,
inspections going to
what
look
we
like?
know, what we
Because
don't
a lot of
know,
members of this
with
administration in the
respect to the
past said that,
MOU. Now, Peter, I'll
IAEA
pass it to you with
inspections were
respect to some
not
of the
sufficient, that
economic and
the
macro
JCPOA under
considerations.
Obama was not
Obviously,
sufficient, that
contributing
it was too weak, that it
a great
didn't give
quote in
us
our
the
sit rep on
necessary
Sunday
visibility
about,
and
here's where
control.
we are
So
and how the
understanding
markets are
how
responding. But
they
any
are
thoughts from you on
trying
kind of
to
where we go
get
from
to
here,
more
how the markets
visibility and
will
more
view
understanding
this,
and more
going
control
through
is
the
going to be
signing on
key,
Friday,
and then how
and
much
where we
that's
take
going
it
to
from here.
be
Yeah, I think
enforceable,
first and foremost, the
sustainable,
markets are just happy that this is
whether or not there
over,
are
right?
maybe
It
snapback
feels like
sanctions,
we're
what
heading
else kind of
towards
is
some sort of
included in
extension,
this, and how that's
no
going
risk
to
of
kind of
escalation
look
anytime
moving
soon.
forward.
So that's
Because
good enough for the
ultimately,
markets for
if
now.
they
I
have a
think
version of what
the
was agreed
president has
on under
often
the
wanted
Obama
to get
administration,
investment.
I
That was
don't think
also
that you
part
can
of
say
Russia
that this
Ukraine.
was
It's
necessarily a
similarly, it's been
success. You
part
have
of
higher
what he's
oil
trying to
prices, you have
do
higher
with
inflation,
Venezuela.
you
I
have
think Venezuela was a
clear
much
costs in
different
terms
case,
of
right? We had
military
a very
readiness. You have
cooperative
13 service members
government,
killed.
and
You have
the
approximately 400
people of
people injured.
Venezuela, and
And
there
so, in
wasn't really a
terms of what's been
regime in the same
accomplished, kind
sense.
of those
I don't know
perceptions, they're
how you're going to
not
convince U.S.
unimportant, and they're
companies to
also
go
going to
into
shape
Iran,
how much they're able
given
to
that
get
the
out of these
IRGC is still in some degree of
negotiations,
power. So I
because
feel that
the U.S.
that
has not
seems a
really
little bit
done a
far-fetched
good job
and
of
wishful
explaining
thinking.
domestically
And I
kind of
think over the
why
next
this
two
needed to
weeks,
happen,
3
why the
weeks,
administration
we
believed
will
this
really
needed to
start
happen,
seeing
why it needed
what
to
the
happen
longer-term
now, what
impact
we
has been
got,
on
what we
the oil
didn't get,
industry
what the intent
from the
was,
attack so far.
and
Like,
then
is
kind of
LNG
who the
back
winner
to
is. And
normal?
without that,
Are
I think
chemical
Iran
plants
comes out of
throughout
this
Asia able
looking
to
kind of
turn on?
stronger, and
I think
that's
there's going to be
not
a
great for
slower
the US's
process of that
negotiating
going
position.
forward.
And
I
on top
continue
of
to
that, I
look
think what's
at
going to be
the
really
January
interesting to watch is
2027
this
contract. It's
congressional kind
still
of
close
back
to
and forth. You saw
$75. It
Congress
was
start to
55
deliver
before the
maybe a
war
rebuke to
started.
the Trump
It does not seem to be
administration.
coming down
Then
anytime
you saw
soon.
maybe them
And a big part of
trying to
that
advance a
is
version of
we've
war
lowered the
powers.
SPR. Some of that has to
And so
get
it's
filled
clear that
back
there's
up.
not really
So I think
consensus
the
right now in
markets may be
Congress,
a
but I
little bit
think that you
too
saw a lot
optimistic
of
what's going on.
very
The one thing that's
vocal
really hard to tell,
statements,
though, there
particularly
is
from
a
some
lot of
historic
optimism in the
Iran
markets
hawks
about
saying,
SpaceX.
that it is
That's
unacceptable
just kind
for
of
us to
really does
walk
open
away
a
with
new
less than
frontier
we
of
had going
investing.
in.
You're seeing
I
excitement. I
don't
think
know how that's
SpaceX
going to
already
look,
announced they're
particularly
doing a
going into the
takeover of someone
midterms. I don't
based on
know
the
how that's going
IPO.
to
They have that
affect things, but I think that
capacity.
it all
We're
will also
looking
play
at
into the
potentially other
negotiations because
AI
IPOs.
It will
So I
impact
do
what is
think
viewed
part
as a
of why
win
markets
and
are
what
rallying
isn't.
so much
So
isn't just the
I
Iran
don't know
deal.
where we
I
will actually
think
go,
we're
but I
really
think that
excited
there's a
about
lot of
those,
kind of
especially the
political
SpaceX for myself,
and
that we're seeing this
perception
opportunity for the market to
swirling that is
expand
going to
and
actually
go
influence the
forward.
negotiations
And
here.
again, I do think, as Spider
Thank you,
says,
Maria.
we will
Peter,
see
I'll pass over
spending
some of your
globally on
thoughts on the
defense.
macro
I
front.
think the U.S. we will also
Obviously,
see
sanctions
kind of
being lifted
the
on the
nascent
Iranian steel,
drone
so oil,
industry really
in
emerge.
dollars for the first time
Whether
in
it's
well over
2
a
weeks,
decade.
whether it's a few months down the road,
Still,
we will see
the
a bigger
asset
shift towards that, which I
unfreezing,
think is
a lot of
exciting.
those points are
And
still
we talked about
TBD.
this
The
a lot. We
timing,
wrote
the
about it this
progress,
weekend.
what
I think
a
the
lot of it was
national
left
security investment
gray
space is
in the
going to be real.
MOU, really just
And we're
likely to
seeing
put some
concerns
additional
around
pressure on the
AI,
Iranians to
what we
keep
can
the
do with
talks
AI.
going and make some
Again, that's
progress
going to
before
continue to
anything
grow.
is discussed
So
there.
I think the
And then
Iran
there was
deal is
obviously the
part of
point
why we're
around
happy, but only a part
foreign
of it.
investment
I think there's
program
a
into
degree of
Iran of
skepticism,
something like
and I'm
$300
going to keep
billion.
watching that
Again,
January
that wouldn't be happening
WTI
now,
contract
and it
and
wouldn't
see
be
what
coming
oil
from the
really
United
looks like.
States.
And I'm still kind of in
Will
that
be
we
a
have
big
higher
carrot out there
inflation
for
for
the Iranians
longer,
to get to a
despite
deal.
this peace
Some of your
agreement.
thoughts on the impacts of over the next 60 days, where the talks
Thank you,
go
Peter.
with
Appreciate
sanctions
it.
being lifted and Iran being able
Spider,
to sell oil again
we'll
freely.
tackle the
And then
nuclear
where do you think
question
that goes
here
from
in
there?
a moment, but just
Yeah. So one, I think just like
pulling
everything
out a
else,
little bit
there's
with
a
respect
he
to
said, she said about
how
almost
this affects the
everything.
region
I think
going
we
forward.
said we're going to sell a bunch
Obviously, a
of
lot of mistrust
soybeans and
amongst
food
the neighbors of
products to
Iran,
Iran and use
following
their
this conflict.
frozen funds to pay for that. They said we're
You know,
not going to do
where
that.
do we
It's
see the
been very unclear. I
relationship
think we've
amongst
said
some of
we
the
won't make
Gulf
any of this
states
$300 billion
going
investment, but I'm
with
not sure
respect
who
to
else signed on to make
engagement
that
with Israel
investment.
moving
So
forward, with
there's a lot of
respect to
back and forth.
engagement
I
with
would say
Iran and
the
other
one thing, I think the
partners? We
market's
obviously
a little
saw,
bit overly
you know,
excited about what's going on with the
UAE
price
pull
of
out
oil
of
right now.
OPEC. I mean,
We are back to what
things have
everyone
been
calls
changing over the last
pre-war
few weeks.
levels. And yes,
And the Middle
oil's
East is
back to
not going to look
levels
the
right
same
before
after
we
this
struck,
conflict. I think we
but
could
it's
probably
still
all
much
agree on
higher than
that.
it was when we started moving.
But with respect to
Troops
engagement from
into the
our
region, right? So
partners
we were
and
kind
the
of
relationships
55,
going
60
forward in the region,
before this all kind
what do you
of
see
started
as
to,
the kind of
prepare for
near-term effects?
escalation.
And
The other
obviously, where do
thing
we go from
is, I
there?
think people are
Yeah,
underestimating, as you pointed out,
I hope,
the
Brett,
impact
really
that the
good question.
sanctions release
I
is
hope the
actually having.
Mideast
Yes,
does
the
look a
strait
little
is
bit
somewhat
different
open,
moving
it's
forward.
returning,
We
but
can
right
only
now
hope
I
for
think it's
that.
the sanction release
And I
that's
don't think
doing a
that's
lot
being
more. It's allowing
Pollyannish about
Iran
this.
to,
Look, the
flood
United
the
States and
market
Israel
effectively with
put
oil,
some
right? They had stuff in
significant
storage.
damage
Their ships have been
on
getting through
the
a little
ability
bit anyways. So I think they are
Iran
well
just to
prepared for this.
exercise
I think
its
we've also kind
domestic
of seen the
obligations to
end
its people. But
of
let's be frank,
OPEC, at least
how
when we
have they
peaked
done that over the
OPEC,
course of 50
where the
years?
other countries in the region who
Anyway,
have also been hurting for
increasingly,
cash are trying to get
Iran
their
has been
market,
isolated
oil
by
to the
its
market, but
neighbors.
they're
I mean, it
growing
kind
it.
of has
What we
been
have not
for
seen yet is what
several
we're going to do
decades,
globally
but
about
that has
strategic
been
petroleum
entrenched.
reserves, right?
Now
It
what
does
we
seem
see
like
after this
part of
punishing
why
epic
there
fury,
was this urgency
we're
for the
going to
deal is
see
the
an effort
strategic
as a
petroleum
part of this
reserve in the
MOU,
U.S. was
possibly,
back to basically the lows
the
that it can get.
desire
There is
to
some amount that
engage
is
with
necessary to
Iran in
keep
a way that
into
has
the storage to maintain
never been
structural
in place
integrity.
since
We're
the
roughly there.
beginning of
So
this
a lot of why oil
regime
never
back in
went much higher than
79.
100
Are we
was
really
partly because
going to
we are doing
move
a very
into
good
an
job
effort to
releasing
try
our
to
strategic
mollify
petroleum reserve?
this
You're now flooding
behavior
it.
that's
I
been in
think we'll have
place?
to wait for a
It's
month or
now
two to see where this
DNA
really
in terms of
settles
how
in.
Iran
How
engages
quickly can the Asian
globally.
chemical and
Is that
fertilizer
going to
plants
be
get back into
modified
production?
because we're going to
What happens
inject
with diesel? I'm still most concerned
economic
about diesel,
opportunities? We're going to
where
try to
we've seen that price go up, and the
address
president has
some
already been complaining
legitimate
that price
concerns
at
that
the
Iran
pumps
has
is
moving
not
forward,
coming down as
whether they
fast as he would like
acknowledge
to see it.
those
I
or
think
not.
the
But this
CEO of
is a
Chevron countered
completely
on that a little
crushed
bit and says it
regime
takes time,
that
right? These things have to work their way through the
can
system.
continue to resist and
So
has
I feel like we're
demonstrated
kind of in
this
this
immense
immediate
resilience.
aftermath and glow
But
where,
is
hey,
it
this is
ever
all
going to
great. I
migrate
think we're still going to
into
have
being
some
a member of
bottlenecks
the
and
community
energy
of
prices are going to be
nations?
higher for longer. Not as high
And
as they were,
specifically
but
within the
nothing's kind
Gulf
of completely
region,
resolved
how
and back to
will
pre-war. I think that's a bit
those
optimistic.
GCC
And
nations
everything else, we'll see it.
respond
It does
to
seem
what
like we
has
are,
been a very
and I
threatening
think both for
engagement
good
and
and bad,
relationship
the
with
president
Iran
wants to
that
turn his
has
attention to
previously
domestic
been
issues,
over the
right? He
horizon?
is
It's
starting to
always
try and
been there.
refocus
It's
on
always been
domestic issues.
incredibly
I
troubling.
think this is an
But
administration
it's never
where
risen to
there
the
is some
level
degree degree of
now
delegation,
the
but
Gulf
relatively
Cooperation
little
Council
gets done
states
without
have an
Trump kind of
entirely
really
different
overseeing it and
perspective,
having a hand in
looking
it. And
outward
I think he
beyond
is
the region.
really
It has been a
tending to
safe
get
haven
back to domestic
for
ahead of
years.
the midterm elections. I
It
think
is
he kind
no
of
longer
wishes he
that,
can wash
or
this
are
away
we
as
going
much
to
as
be able
possible,
to
get whatever
yo-yo
victory
back
he
into
can,
that
and move on.
because
So
of
that's
efforts
kind of where
coming
I'm
out of this
expecting to see a
MOU?
return
I
to
hope
focus
the
on
Mideast
space,
looks
quantum,
different.
AI, kind of
Iran
the really
is
interesting things that are
continuing to
driving this
be
economy,
isolated and
electricity
will
production, the
isolate
rare earths and
itself.
critical minerals,
But will
all things
there
that we are
be,
making a lot of
through this
progress on
economic
that I don't want to
application
say
of power,
derailed, but
the
certainly have
ability to
slowed
alter
down.
what the
So I think
regime
that's
looks
where this
like and
comes
how it
back,
engages?
and
And again,
everything,
there
I
will
guess,
be a
is
long
hedging on
horizon
what,
in terms of that.
Sarah
So
and probably
will
Trey
there
will point
be
out, and Maria,
strategic patience
it
in
seems
order
very
to
tentative, this
try
piece,
to
that there
adjust
might
what
be some
Iran looks like
escalation,
going
but I don't think
forward?
there's going to be any
Or are we
escalation that
going to
really
have
derails the market front of
continually
this right
a
now. I think people are
punishing
still going to
and
believe
punitive
that everything
and
somehow
very aggressive
normalizes to
relationship
whatever the
with
new normal
Tehran,
is.
with no
No, thank you,
indication
Peter. Yeah,
that
we'll
there's
have to keep
going
a
to be
close eye
some
on these
type of a
talks as we'll
modification
likely
or
hear
an
a lot of announcements and
adjustment to
updates and
what that leadership
contradictions
perspective looks like.
But we'll see
In
if
other
we can get
words,
to a final
will
deal,
Iran
and at
be
that
able
point
to
we'll obviously be able
alter
to
its
compare
perspective
to
in terms of
whatever
leadership
final
moving
deal
forward? Will
arises
the
to the
regime go
JCPOA.
away? Will it
These
dissipate? Will it
talks
look
could
like
continue and get
something
extended.
different than what it's looked like
We
over
will
the past
have to
50
see what happens
years?
here, but we'll obviously keep a
We can
close
hope for
eye on
that,
that.
and
Let's
we've
shift
given
gears
them
a
a
little
good
bit and
push
talk
to move
about
in that
Cuba.
direction. It's
With
going
the
to take
recent
some
increase
time,
in
but I
U.S.
think the
pressure,
economic
the economy
engagement
there is faltering.
will cause us
Blackouts for
to have a
over
different
30 hours
perspective
at a
and
time,
hopefully different relationships moving
inflation,
forward. But I
and
think it
lots
is
of other
important from
issues
the
going on
military
in
and
Cuba.
strategic
Some recent
perspective.
news
The
around
GCC states
Cuba
are going
effectively
to
going to
take
more of
the
a free
lead.
market reform
They don't
plan.
have to
We'll
take
see
the
if
lead,
that
but they
buys the
will take
regime
the
some
lead in terms
time.
of what
But
their
the U.S.
defense
pressure
posture
continues.
looks like.
Other countries are
The
coming in
U.S.
to try and
still
provide some
will be very
assistance
much a
with
part of that.
providing humanitarian aid, and Mexico offered to
Thank
sell
you, Spider.
additional fuel to the island.
With
But
respect to
the U.S.
economic
has been
engagement,
clear, changes need to happen
with the
within the
Iranians,
regime. Trey, I'll pass it
as
to
we
you for some
move
of your
forward
thoughts on where we
during
go
the
with Cuba
negotiation
in the near term as
process
well.
in the 60 days, some
Thanks, Brett.
sanctions
And it's
could
great
be
to be
lifted
here
on
with
a
the team.
performance
You know,
basis
as I
or a
was
progress
reading
basis.
in the last 24
Some
to 48
assets
hours,
could
some of the
be
reports
unfrozen
coming
in
out
other
of
countries
Cuba,
that could
it
potentially
strikes
be
me
available to the
that
Iranians
this might
to
be a bit of a
rebuild
historic week.
infrastructure, not weapons
These
programs, not
emergency
fund proxies,
economic
not
overhaul
try and dig up
measures
nuclear
are as
material, or
far-ranging
continue to
and
enrich, but
sweeping as we've
rebuild the
seen to the
civilian
island
infrastructure and help the
since
people.
Fidel Castro came to power in
What other carrots does the
1959.
U.S.
The proof
have
will
to
be in the
move
pudding.
Iran
But if
through
you
this
look
next
at
60
all
days?
of these
They're obviously
measures,
proven they're
which,
very good
at least
at
for the Prime
stretching
Minister
things
and the
out
President,
as
they
long as they
consider
possibly
part of
can. So
a
the 60-day
normal
time frame
socialist project.
is
It's
definitely
not normal.
optimistic.
Something has
What are your thoughts
precipitated
around
this.
ways that we can move
And
Iran,
I think that all of
continually
us
move
would
them
probably
through that
agree that
6-day
yes,
period
the
to get to
pressure
more of a
campaign has
definitive
been
nuclear
working to
agreement
affect some
by
change.
using some
The
of the
energy
economic
embargo,
levers
the
as
targeting
potential
of the
benefits to
military
them to
conglomerate,
encourage them to get
the
to where they'd
case
like them to
against
be.
Raul Castro. These
I would
things
suggest
have
up front
had an effect
that
based on what was
a
just
resumption
announced
of
in
the
the last
application
24
of
to
force
72
will
hours.
not
Now the
accomplish
game of chess,
what
though,
you've just described
to
as the
ensure
desired outcome.
that we
I
don't
think
have
we've
an
seen over
utter
the course of these
collapse
108
and then
days
a
that
calamity
increasing
whereby
military
then,
pressure
to
will
your
break
point,
a bunch
Brett,
of things, kill
the
a bunch
Chinese
of
come
people.
in
It's not going
with
to
additional
fundamentally alter the
humanitarian help.
perspective
They come to the
and
rescue,
the dynamic of that
and we're
leadership
cast
in
into
Tehran.
a
So
more
let's not
negative
put
light.
good money
This
after
is the
bad, or
balancing
good
act
money
of
after good
diplomacy.
money.
This is
I
the
don't think it's
balancing
going
act of
to
economic sanctions and
provide
economic
the investment
pressure,
that we, or the return
embargoes,
on the investment
etc.
that we want at this point.
And we just have to be careful. But at this
I
juncture,
do
I think that a lot of us will have to acknowledge that the pressure has at least
and it has
begotten
before,
some change.
and we've got to bound this thing, and that's the
I'll
it's
pass to you for a
sanctions
couple
relief.
thoughts on Cuba as well.
If there can be an
So as I watch
injection
Cuba,
of
I think
cash
this
into
is
this regime and
really
allows
an
them to
area
start the
where there's a
rebuild
lot of
process,
confidence that the United
that's
States can
great.
have great
However, we
impact
have to
on
expect
this
that they're
particular
going
area.
to
The
veer off the
success that we've
course as
had
quick
with
of the course of what
the
this
shift
agreement looks
in
like, and we
both
have to
Central and South
anticipate
America,
their desire to have a
really
nuclear
looking
weapon will
at
remain
a shift away
inviolate.
from left to
Their
more
desire
right
to
to
have
center right.
to protect
I think that
themselves
really
and to
emboldens
exercise power
us as we look at this particular
fundamentally
area.
through the
War
use of the
on
proxies
drugs and
that they've built up
the
over the years,
narco
and
terrorists that
their
have been coming
incipient
across
and
and
growing
being
missile
shut down.
defense and
I think all
missile
of that is starting to have an effect.
development
When I look at
process. We have
Cuba,
to anticipate that. So
I
how
would
do we
say
put
Cuba is
boundaries around
probably
that? We have to be very
the most
cautious.
challenging in
If
many
we
ways
neuter Iran
of an
too much,
environment
if
to
they,
go
as a
after, just
sovereign nation,
because
Iran
of
is a
the
sovereign
level
nation, it's got the
of
right to defend
competition
itself,
that's been there
but
with
not to
Russia. But I think that this, like
extend and be
Trey
aggressive over
articulated
the
so
horizon,
well,
which it
that
has
this is a unique
fundamentally
time
put
frame for Cuba
as
to
its
really be able
strategic
to
objective.
change its model
We have to be
and
able
bring some
to
economic
realize that if we neuter it,
success
if
and
we crush it too
economic
much, if we don't
prosperity to
allow
a people that
certain
have suffered greatly.
opportunities
So
for Iran
as I
to
look at the
establish
particular work
and reaffirm
that's
their
been going on,
sovereignty,
cutting
then
off a
it's
lot
an
of those
invitation for
sources of
China to come
revenue
walking in. It's an invitation
through
for
different
Russia. It's
elements
an
of
invitation
power
for North Korea
are
at this
really coming to
axis
bear.
of
And I do
upheaval
think that
to
this
be
is
very
a
much a part of
fundamentally
Tehran
just
moving
a great
forward.
opportunity
If
at this
they
point for the
agree
Cuban
to,
people
and we
to find
insist
some
and can
level of
verify
prosperity and
that we
greater
have
integration
not allowed
into a
Tehran to
broader
establish
economic economic
form
market
of
as we go
national
forward.
security
But
that
I do
allows them
think,
to
you know,
protect
that South
themselves.
America
This will be
is
an
really
invitation for
fascinating as well.
those
And I know
nations
that's
to
not
very much
the real
provide,
focus,
not through
but
proxies,
watching
but
that
they will be
shift
very
of
much the
valuing
guarantors
security, the
of
drug,
their security.
counter drug
Yeah, and I
work
would
that's
just
going
add, Brett, I
on, that
think
all of these shifts
on the
really
economic side,
look
it's
at
really
a
tricky, right?
hemisphere that
Because
is
money is
changing rather
fungible and you can
radically
try and monitor what they
and
spend,
really
but to the extent they
shifting
have
in a
hidden
seismic
resources that they've
way
been
that has
using,
not been
that frees up those
potential
hidden
in
resources to do other
recent
things.
history.
I think Spider's spot on with China.
No, thank
China
you,
kind of
Sarah.
continued to
I'm
try
going
and
to pass
trade
to you
with
for
him.
any thoughts
China
on Cuba as
continued to
well.
try and provide them and probably did provide them with
Thanks,
some
Brett.
precursor
I
elements
mean, I think
during the
everyone hit
war.
a lot
So
of
I feel
what
it's going to be
I
very
would also
difficult for us
say, but
to
I think
break
that
them away from
seeing the
China.
economic
I keep
reforms,
coming
you
back
had
to the fact that China actually has a trade surplus with Iran, which strikes you as weird given how much military equipment, how much energy they're buying from them. So I think that's going to be hard to break. I think what's also going to be really interesting is how do the Gulf nations that are still around convince the rest of the world that oil from them is safe? I think we are going to see U.S. oil companies. I think you're going to see Canadian oil companies aggressively move towards, hey, you should be trading with us. We are much safer to deal with. I think this is part of this whole shifting of this world order where we had this kind of globalization where everyone kind of trusted everyone to some degree, and there's going to be moving down to vertically integrated nations. I think it's going to turn out to be a huge opportunity for some of the European energy companies where their own countries start saying, hey, enough's enough. We have to make sure that we have a degree of energy dependence. So I'll be watching really closely to see what the UAE, what Dubai, what these areas can do to convince U.S. and European companies that that is still where you want to be invested, that they are growth in the future, etc. Because 6 months ago, that's the pace they were on. And everything I look at is people are going to be very reluctant to build data centers unless they're hardened there. But that takes away some of their cheapness if you have to build these kind of hardened data centers. Any energy supply coming from them is probably going to have to be hardened in ways that's different than before. I think yes, we'll kind of accept the strait is working right now, but you will see alternative paths, whether it's pipelines, etc. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of rebuilding and spending in the other parts, and that'll be curious to see how involved the U.S. is, how much do they do on their own, whether Europe can come in. So again, I think this is, I don't think we ever go back to business as usual on the energy business. I think enough has changed here that countries across the globe are looking and saying, hey, we can't depend on this. It might have been different if we really did have true U.S. investment in Iran and a true kind of regime change. It just feels like we're far away from that. And I'm unfortunately kind of in this camp, and maybe Spider is too. It feels like it's really going to be difficult not to be back in 2 or 3 years. That the second we kind of take our eyes off the ball, stuff starts to go sideways there. And that we might still be pleasantly surprised. But
Peter, I think you're spot on. I mean, that's kind of the perspective that where we are now in this operation against Iran has not strategically altered anything other than we've got a bunch of dead guys and we've got a regime and we don't know who's in charge, and that's exactly what the Iranians want, so they can sustain this negotiation period. I would anticipate we're going to go from a 60-day interregnum to
before we shift over to Russia-Ukraine, any thoughts on Cuba as well as we continue to apply the pressure with change hopefully coming? We'll see what form that change takes.
I think it's fair to say from a corporate perspective,
yeah, I think in
corporations have forever been organized around
the
efficiency.
U.S. economy. I think it would be a bigger deal for the Cuban economy, but it's such a small fraction of anything.
I think we are migrating to the period where efficiency obviously is still required, but we've got to put an emphasis on resilience, which means
what I do think will be curious is, as Maria
so
pointed out,
we're going to see that part of the world. We're not going to walk away from that part of the world, but I think there will be investment in that part of the world. And Peter, you nailed it in terms of how do you make a more resilient presence in that part of the world that allows you to enjoy the benefits of that and the rewards of that. But it's going to cost you a little more money. We're going to harden our facilities. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to have those kinds of engagements with Bahrain, with the Emirates, with Qatar, etc. That makes sense, and it can continue to make sense. But we're in a position where it's just going to cost us more to do that. So do you walk away with that, or do you say, no, this can work? So this really fundamentally goes to the challenges that we've seen over the course of probably the last 5 to 6 years, which is spheres of influence are being challenged across the board. How in fact do nations engage? What have we taken for granted? And now what are we going to have to do differently? And Peter, you've described that to us very well in terms of
shifting gears a little bit over to
production
Russia
for security.
And Ukraine.
Nations need to be able to figure out what
rage
must we be able to guarantee,
making some
and how do we
progress.
do that?
They've had some successes with longer-range strikes into Crimea, into Moscow, at the refinery. And it's happening more frequently.
Those are the key
and they're
questions
doing
right
all
now.
of this with their technology,
but I do
which
think
is
it's
pretty
more
incredible.
a movement toward resilience
the G7
and
meeting in
acknowledgement
France
that
overshadowed by a lot of the Iran MOU signing, but Ukraine was discussed.
We have to accord resilience.
And the question now is, how will the U.S.
allocation of dollars and
EU
organizational
to get more involved here? Obviously, beyond the $106 billion aid package that it will allow
the pursuit of nuclear.
to continue to fight.
I do think not only
going forward,
is Iran going to want a nuclear, because
some of your
you
thoughts
just have to look at the Venn diagram of countries that we will
Is
attack
Putin ready for a
and
peace?
countries we won't. And there
Would
seems
he
to be a
potentially
pretty
come to the
clear
table if he thinks his hand is
view that
a
if you
little bit
have a
weaker?
nuclear weapon, you are
Obviously, in the
much
shadow
safer
of
from
the
attack
Ukrainian
from us or
successes
anyone
over the
else.
last few months.
And I think that's
pass you
also
for
going
some
to
of your
be
thoughts as
something
well.
Europe looks at. I think the whole world, unfortunately, is going to push
Yeah,
towards
I
nuclearization rather
do
than
not
pulling
see
away. I
Putin
hope I'm
coming
wrong
to
on
the
that,
table, and
but it
certainly
feels like a pretty
this group
logical outcome of all of
can
this
talk to
is
that as
you are better
well.
off having a nuke than not having a
The
nuke
level of
if you
casualties, the
are, especially if you're a
personal
troublemaker.
commitment
So
that he
I
has to
And,
think
this particular
that's the
conflict, I
challenge
don't
of
see him
globalization.
even with
Globalization is that
the
we can,
current
number
situation
one,
where
it's the
they
world that
are
we've known for
losing
the
some
past
of the
80 plus
ground that they
years.
had taken. I don't
We
see
can
him
get along.
backing
We
down
need
at
to
this point.
realize that we're going to make an
As I
effort to
look at it,
maintain those
the
connections,
Ukrainians have
economic connections,
realized
diplomatic
through a bunch
communications,
of not only their own
sharing
ingenuity, but
scar
also the
tissue and
contributions of
sharing
outside
experiences. And
like-minded
now we're moving
countries
down the
have
path
contributed
of
to allow them to
challenges to
create a force
globalization.
now that can power
And
project,
you
and they're
can't,
being allowed to
the
power
notion
project into
being
Russia. I
the
do see
challenge to
that
globalization means
Russia will try
there
to own
have
some
been,
level of
as you've
escalation.
described,
Historically, they
nations
have
that have been the
threatened
superpowers. And then
neighbors
if at
and
some point
really
you
use
extend that
their
down the road, all of a
particular
sudden
capabilities,
everybody's
whether it's
beholden to
conventional or
one of those
nuclear, to
superpowers.
threaten
And there's
other
a challenge
countries
to
in the
that.
region.
So
I
the notion
wouldn't
of
be surprised
globalization
to
is
see that
being
escalation
beaten
continue
about
as we
pretty
move
aggressively
forward.
right now. And it's
I
not
think the
just
biggest thing
this
that we've seen is
administration,
the
but it's
ability
also
for
the notion of other
disruptive
nations. If
technology to
you've
really
described, we've
alter a
had a
battlefield.
globalized
And
connectivity.
while this
Now all
is
of a
not a
sudden the
world of air
different nations
superiority
of the
in the
world say,
classic US
I
sense, and
need to
it would
be
be
able
somewhat of a
to meet
different
all of
battle,
those
this
requirements of
is
my national
really a
security. And so I'm
sea
going to start
change in
putting
the
walls
way of
up. I'm
war
going to
that we
start
are seeing
distancing myself.
being
I'm going to
enabled by
increase
some of these
my
medium
requirements for X, Y, and
range
Z.
strike
That's the
capabilities,
problem.
and the
That's the
cost point
extreme
is
of what we're
compelling,
talking about.
allowing
I hope
countries like
certainly
Ukraine to
we pray that
effectively
that's not the
fight back.
case.
And
But
I
you're
think
right. It's
countries,
got to be addressed.
China, Russia, United States, even
Absolutely. And
are
we,
all
in
taking
the
note
last few
and
minutes that we
adjusting
have, wanted to
how we look at particular
address that specifically,
capabilities and what we need
the
to have
nuclear
within
discussion
ours.
over the next
But I
60
don't
days.
see this really, I don't see
How
Putin
optimistic
doing
are
anything
we
other than
that at
continuing
60
on his
days
path
or at 90
and
or
possibly
120, however
escalating
long
as
this
he moves
takes,
forward. I don't see
that
him
we will get to a point
backing
where
down
we are at least
under any
comfortable
type of pressure.
that
Over.
we have a deal where we will be retrieving
Trey, I'll pass
the
over to you
highly
for some of your thoughts on where
we
you think the
will
conflict goes into some.
be observing
It's
the
an amazing week
Iranians
when you think about it. What
take
strikes
apart their
me
nuclear program,
is
and
the
also
targeting and
be open to
specifically
inspections at
the
a very
fact
aggressive pace
that
if we
Sevastopol
think
was
that is the
hit
best path forward, which it
quite
likely is,
substantially
to ensure that they
just
will
in the
not
last
move
several days.
beyond any kind of
To review,
civilian nuclear
Sevastopol
program.
was the crown jewel of the
Obviously
Ukrainians
big
on
hurdles
the Crimea.
there.
This is
Despite
a
some of your thoughts
counter-value
on,
strike going against one
do
of the
we think,
major
in light of everything we just
energy
talked about
hubs
with
there
respect to
on that
nuclear
particular
being the key
city,
deterrent,
at
no
that
one's
city.
attacking North
And
Korea.
so
I mean,
it
this
has
is
an
exactly
effect.
why they are pursuing this
I think
capability.
Sarah's onto something, though.
But what do you think the
we
chances are
tend
that
to
we get
see
to that
Putin and
in
the
the near
Russians
term,
kind of
the
defy
medium term?
gravity with that sort of pressure.
The problem with
But they are
nukes,
feeling it.
we've
And
described
what
where
strikes
we were
me
with
here is the role of
JICPOA
nodal
under the
analysis.
Obama
We're going to talk about nodal analysis from an
Trump
economic
1.0
perspective when we talk
eliminated
about
it.
China here in a few
Are we
minutes.
going to see a
This is
resurrection
targeting
of some of those,
nodal analysis and trying to
those
maximize
statutes within that
its
agreement?
effect.
I think it really comes
This
down
is
to three things.
I have written,
One
at
is,
least this is a
what does the
reluctant
infrastructure
revolution in
look
military
like, the
affairs that we're
nuclear,
seeing, where
highly
people don't
enriched
necessarily
infrastructure? What does it look
enjoy
like?
the
Does
fact
that
that
get
we're
dismantled?
we're seeing
And how do we
non-proximal
verify
warfare,
that?
but it
So
is having an effect.
really,
And so for the Ukrainians,
we're in a
deep
position
strike,
where we
nodal
would acknowledge
analysis.
that needs to take
Who
place.
knows what this
But there
begets?
are
In
going
our
to be
conversation
elements
vis-a-vis
within
the
that
Strait of
that will
Hormuz.
still allow, I think,
If you
Iran
start to see the
to be
enhanced
a
flow
part
of oil,
of
we may see the United States reimpose sanctions
nuclear,
against
commercial nuclear
Russia.
business,
So there's
which
additional
is an
leverage
international
there.
global
I think this is going to be
business.
a very interesting
How do we
summer,
do that?
especially as hot
That's
as it
number
is.
one. So it's the infrastructure. What is the status of the
Thank you, Trey.
infrastructure?
Maria,
Second thing is,
I'll pass over to you for some of your thoughts
do
on
we
the
even know
conflict
what
as
the
well. You always
inventory
have
of the
such
highly
wonderful
enriched
perspective
uranium is? What's the
on
denominator? We
all
have to
going
know
on
with a
respect
level
to
of
Russia and Ukraine.
certainty
I'll pass to
that
you.
this is what we are
Thanks,
going to try
Brett.
to either retrieve, render
you guys know
safe,
it's
or
my favorite subject.
achieve a
So,
dilute
zooming
the and achieve a status where it's
Ukraine
no
is
longer
clearly
threatening.
doing very well.
And the third thing is inspections.
Trump likes a winner. He
The
tweeted
problem
in
with
support
the
of
JIC
Zelensky, so
POA, fundamentally, the problem, there are
perception-wise,
several, but the problem with
Ukraine's
the JIC
doing
POA is
very
there
well.
were no
They're
unannounced and
innovating,
aggressive
they're manufacturing
unannounced
drones,
inspection
they're
protocol
pioneering a ton of
that
really cool
denied
satellite
the
internet
ability of
solutions,
international
and,
agencies to come in and
striking, like,
routinely
smoke
kick the
over
tires
Moscow,
on
is just a
the
really
enrichment process that
incredible
Iran
sight
have.
if you think about kind
That's
of what
the
people's
problem that
expectations are
needs to be
when this
addressed.
war
So
started.
if those three
That
things can be
said,
addressed,
though, a lot
I'm
of these so
optimistic we
far,
can
they've
move in that
started
direction. The
hitting
problem
some more
is,
kind of
how
more
do the
strategic
Iranians
targets.
feel about
So far,
all
it's been a
that?
little bit
Will they
more
agree to
symbolic.
this aggressive
I
inspection
think that
program?
one
They
place where
should.
this might really shift
Dismantling of their
is
program.
what happens with Belarus.
Is it entirely dismantled, or does it still give them the ability to reach a level of enrichment that gives them commercial power?
How effective that would be or would not be
is it going to be completely eliminated and they're going to have to buy it off the market?
Questions about the efficacy of the Belarusian armed forces.
Those are the key issues that need to be addressed, and I simply can't handicap how that's going to move forward. What I can say with a level of certainty is that at the end of 60 days, we'll be moving into another period of negotiation, which I think is exactly what the Iranians want. Gives them an opportunity to address those issues and make them that much more difficult to get our arms around.
So that is not just
that's not just a threat. That's obviously the issue of the
against Lukashenko. It is also a very significant threat to Russian military capabilities, an ongoing threat to Russian military
capabilities. How front and center will that be in a final agreement? If we basically said the nuclear program is our number one concern.
We're definitely seeing other things that are also indicating that the Ukrainian push is successful. I think that a lot of times
at least we know that's going to put them significantly behind the eight ball with respect to timing, and that's what we're obviously ultimately trying to do is kick us out as far as we can. Hopefully never. But definitely give us some additional breathing room where we know they're not going to be on an imminent breakout cycle. We're going to give them some carrots to get towards that outcome that we would obviously like to have. But there's so many other points to consider. Obviously, the situation with Hezbollah is not resolved. I mean, Netanyahu has effectively said, one, we're not party to this deal. We obviously respect the U.S. opinion here. We obviously acknowledge that Iran never achieving a nuclear weapons capability is the end goal of what we're all trying to do here.
Long-term demographic
but there are other things out there. One,
that's not even mentioning the crisis
Hezbollah
of those who are returning with
two,
PTSD, with
even
missing
years
limbs,
from now, the IRGC and the Iranians will still be a threat to Israel. So lots of things to understand with respect to where we go from here.
People turn down these enlistment bonuses.
I'll give you a last word on just any your final economic thoughts around what we can expect over the next few weeks.
They're multiple years of people's salaries, and they're still
having trouble. I think what I'm most excited about is hopefully that this allows the president to turn his attention to the domestic market a little bit more. I do think that he delegates better maybe than he did versus Trump 1.0, but he still has to be directly involved in almost any big decision-making thing. And I feel getting the grid up to speed, getting electricity going, supporting the data centers and AI, getting the rare earths and critical minerals back on track where we can be competitive with China on the processing and refining of those things has to be a focus. I think there's been an underlying current of that being worked on while the Iran war has been going on. But I do think he has been really dragged into this very personally. It takes up his time. It has pulled our attention away from other things. So I think that's what I'm looking for is back to this real shift on where's the U.S. economy headed, this production for security, and ramping that up. It's been going on in the background, but I think it's one or two notches below where it is when Trump has his direct involvement, just as everything is with this administration. And so if he can kind of get his attention back to that, I think that's what we need. That's probably what he needs coming into the midterms is just let's just off to the side, let it simmer or whatever it goes, but let's see where this develops. And again, I'm excited, I think, for the energy business. I think Europe is going to have to turn to themselves, to Canada, to the U.S. more. So there's a lot of good that can come out of this. I think our involvement in the region, we're obviously going to stay there. We're going to have to work with the Gulf states and figure out where they want us to do. But I think the real opportunity for the next few months is back to the domestic economy. I think there will be a focus, and that's what I'm looking for.
I think the question will be as to
thank you, Spider, so much for your time today. Peter, always great to speak with you both. And to all the listeners, we'll keep you posted moving forward with respect to your reports around the world, sit reps, and obviously, of course, in-person virtual engagement. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
I think that now it's coming to this kind of almost inevitability point that at some point, and I'm not saying this is going to happen in the next year, but I think we are seeing very significant signs of this regime deteriorating. And I think to kind of ignore that is just almost blind. I think there's a lot of people who have said in the past, Russia's kind of this superpower, all wars end in negotiation, and so on. They end when one side fundamentally gives up, and because they've lost too much. And so I think that right now on the balance, that is far more likely to be Russia than it is to be Ukraine.
We look forward to sharing with you again soon.
So we'll see, but certainly a fun summer so far.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Peter, I'll pass you before we switch over to China. Any thoughts about Russia, Ukraine, the EU getting a little bit more involved, potentially, in not only the economic side, but pushing the sides together to come to a deal? And do we think that we're any closer to one today than we were even a few months ago?
Well, I haven't bought my flights to Kiev yet, but it does feel like there has been progress. Again, I think when I go back to listen to what the geopolitical intelligence group was saying they would have done had they been attacked on day one, right? We would have attacked supply chains. We would have attacked all these things that effectively Ukraine was restricted from doing for multiple years. So it's kind of Ukraine's finally implementing strategies that would have been kind of warfare 101. So it does seem to be helpful. I think the one big takeaway to me in all of this is where are we going to invest in drones? Where is this going to occur on the globe? I think I've talked about it somewhat tongue in cheek, but I think, Europe needs to create an Airbus for drones. They're never going to build out a true military industrial base. They just don't have the capacity. And I think Airbus was done to make wide body jets and get around some of the political issues where each country had their own fan favorite. And they almost have to do the same thing to do drones. And if you're going to spend $100 billion in the next 2 years, your ability to create a real military is about nil probably for Europe, whereas creating something that's a powerful looking at least deterrent on the drone side I think is real. I thought it was really interesting. The US military just released a surface drone exercise that we held in the Asia Pac region. So again, I think you're seeing surface drones added to that. I know the president right now has been out talking to a lot of the defense contractors. We are pursuing giving 7-year contracts so that the companies can actually build additional facilities to ramp up, because I think these 1 and 2 year contracts did not give our companies that comfort. But I think the next level of this is I'm really curious to see what we kind of unleash in terms of drone strategies, surface, air, everything, right? I know we've been working on it. It's probably been a little bit top secret. It's probably been a little bit back, delayed because it wasn't maybe our focus. All of that has to be escalating. So I think that's where the investment horizon's coming, where we see this, where we see it adapt, where AI fits into all of this. And I know it's not quite space related, but I think you talked about the satellites, the needs for all that. I think the US has kind of underinvested in terms of space for defense purposes. And I think that's also going to come out of this administration. So I think we're going to see a lot of spending in this area. And I think those are the sort of things we're looking for investment opportunities. And it all feels like it's coming on the back of this. As Maria said, right? Trump likes winners and he's seeing Ukraine win. They are getting deals with other countries. They're pursuing this. I'm reasonably excited about what this means for the global economy, for getting that region back in traction. And I think earlier we talked about, the ability to invest in Iran. I just don't see that as really being very feasible. On the other hand, I do think there will be opportunities, particularly for US companies, to invest in Russia and Ukraine if some sort of a deal is struck. That is definitely one of the things the president has been looking for in the past. And I see fewer obligations, fewer impediments to getting that done. So I could see that being the opportunity. And really, I still think the big winner of all of this will be Poland, and that Poland will become a staging ground for these companies that want to invest in Russia and Ukraine. So I think we've seen a transfer of power within even the EU to countries like Poland. And I think that's just going to start catching on as we start seeing a peace settle in. I just view Poland as very well positioned. They've done a phenomenal job during this. So that's where I'd be looking for investment and growth, I think, is in that region.
No, thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. Shifting gears a little bit over to China. Following the summit, the good news was a little bit of trade tension, was taken away. It looks like the summit went well from a relationship point of view. Not a lot of key takeaways, but things look like they were at least going to be a little smoother moving forward. That is just a few weeks later seeming to crack. A few weeks ago, the Pentagon, effectively restricted some Chinese companies based off of their sales to Chinese military entities. And then vice versa, this week, China came back and restricted access to a couple companies, including critical minerals companies here in the United States. So tensions continue on the economic front. In addition, China is exercising a little bit more authority around Taiwan with respect to obstructing freedom of navigation, intercepting ships around Taiwan over the last few days. That has definitely raised the attentions of the Europeans, effectively saying, this is outrageous and potentially dangerous. And then finally, in addition to a standoff, really following the end of the joint exercise between the U.S., Philippines, and Japan. Most recently, there was a standoff between the Chinese Coast Guard and a Philippine vessel as well around the Scarborough Shoal. So, no lack of tensions. But, Sarah, I'll pass it to you, and then we'll kick it over to Trey for some of the latest analysis around where we think relations go with China and any concerns around tensions going from here.
No, I think you, Brett, you sort of captured the atmospherics quite well. China continues to really use its access and control of major parts of the economic chain that we rely on. So their control of rare earths, their control of key metals, all the way down to pharmaceuticals and other areas. As they exercise that control, though, that is somewhat helpful to the cause of really showing the level of control that China has, and really motivating the rest of the globe to go after these supply chains and really build the resilience that they need. It used to be a bad word; it was redundancy. Now it's resilience. And so I think when they overplay their hand to a point, I think it's good because it really hammers home what we've allowed to happen through globalization. The onshoring of capabilities is something that has to happen, and there has to be something that drives independent countries to go ahead and onshore industrial capacity. They have to really stand up some types of access to key minerals, key metals, other areas, and you don't do that without something driving you, especially when China controls the price point. So they're so good at undercutting any type of price point that we have that as soon as we do that, that reduction in their ability to undercut markets is really detrimental to the onshoring that needs to happen. But they do, they're big beneficiaries of the distraction of the rest of the world as we look. Russia, Ukraine, Iran, it really takes our focus off some of the activities that they're doing. And I think they're exercising those activities in their backyard. And I think they will continue while they think we're distracted and maybe pulled off from our focus. That allows them to really to flex their muscles in their own backyard. And they continue to do that, whether it's, establishing presence, their fishing vessels, their Coast Guard, all these things that they do in the gray zone, they are allowed to flex and really establish conflict. And what it does do, though, for us is it really focuses some of our key allies in the area, Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines. I think they realize the threat that they're under. And like I went back to the discussion of Russia, Ukraine, these countries have the ability to capitalize on some of these lower cost weapon systems that could be put together to guard their backyard. It is hard for somebody to penetrate and project power, and China doesn't have a lot of experience in doing that, I think. But as long as they keep a gray zone, it's much more difficult to counter what they're doing. And that's what I think we will continue to see them try to stay within that uncertainty.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Troy, I'll pass you some of your thoughts around tensions, especially at sea around Taiwan, and what you see going forward.
Yeah, I'll finish with the maritime piece because I think it is important. As I look at the events of June, what I'm seeing, and to kind of draw on this word nodal analysis, we just saw it play out in some of the deep strike conversation we had about Ukraine's activity in Russia. We're starting to see in June, especially some nodal analysis as to specific companies against which there will be pressure, both by the United States and by the Chinese. I find that very interesting, not whole sectors. So it is a more graduated but very specific approach. Just to your point, we added to a blacklist 65 new entities as part of the Chinese military companies list. And then their response just several days ago, very specific in dual-use goods and U.S. defense and industrial suppliers, targeting U.S. rare earth supply, being very specific to it, and then also bans against and some major primes, U.S. primes, that actually don't have that much, in terms of what they're selling directly inside of China, but it's still symbolic. It's showing that they are doing their research to specific companies and trying to make it hurt, or at least give the impression that it hurts. What's interesting about the Chinese is that they can always play chess with other assets and other things that apply pressure. And this is a good segue then to the maritime. Yeah, you've got an exercise occurring just off the coast of Taiwan. It's Taiwan's really important exercise, and lo and behold, you have the Chinese carrier come in and create a problem. The challenges that the Chinese Coast Guard have been extending to maritime traffic. Again, they're playing every card they can, and so This is the nature of behavior for the Chinese. They will find other forms of leverage. If they back off in one, they'll accelerate in the other. It's something that we've become quite good at ourselves. But to Sarah's point, we do need to have some burden sharing in this regard to make sure that everybody's in this particular dynamic.
No, thank you, Trey. Peter, I'll pass you for the last word around the recent economic tension with China. Where do you think the relationship goes from here?
Yeah, I think as we kind of highlight at every meeting, it's while Iran and other things may be very tactical and maybe have strategic longer term implications, the real competition is still with China. And we are in the process of moving from a rules-based world order, where if anyone was flaunting the rules, it was China, to something where I think everyone's going to be a little bit more independent, right? It's kind of vertically integrated nations. And I think that process of getting one to the other is going to be volatile. There's going to be intense competition. I think, as Trey pointed out perfectly well, China will play this from all sorts of angles. We are sometimes good at that. Sometimes I think we turn our attention and kind of forget about things and lose a march to China on this. And we've got to make sure we don't do that. And this all fits into our exact investment theme, this production for security, or PROSEC. I think everyone is becoming much more aware that we have to move from just in time to just in case, that resiliency. And I can tell you, when I talk about the concept of PROSEC replacing ESG as the main kind of investment and guiding philosophy for corporations and asset managers, people kind of looked at me like I had two heads a year ago. 6 months ago, it was kind of like, that's weird, but some people kind of believed it. A lot of people are nodding their heads and seeing this shift in how they are thinking about investing, how they're thinking about running their corporations, and it is much more along these lines of national security. What do we do as a company to make this make sense? And I think they're seeing that driven by the U.S. government. And again, Europe's not quite there yet. They often need to be kicked in the head 5 or 6 times before they finally get it. But they are moving that direction, right? You are seeing Europe kind of, France is trying to do things France thinks they need to do. Germany's finally trying to do things Germany thinks they need to do. And it's all around electricity and energy production. Again, I keep saying this, and I think it's starting to resonate, is we have to think about a country like a human being. And what is the equivalent to a country of air? We cannot live without air for more than 3 minutes. Electricity is really high on that list. You saw what happened in Spain recently when they had brownouts. You're seeing what's happening in the aftermath of the horrible earthquakes in Venezuela. A lack of electricity is incredibly dangerous. So I think that's going to build out chip industry. And then what's the equivalent of water that maybe we can last 3 days without? Those are going to be industries again. Maybe it's rare earths, critical minerals, those things. And I think there's this realization we have to do it. And I keep highlighting to people that they should go back to the national security strategy, which we haven't completely followed since it came out in November. But I think it's a pretty clear indication that there is going to be a lot of work done ensuring North, Central, South America is safe for U.S. commerce, and that shipping lane should not be taken for granted. We have this chart that has been getting a lot of resonance where it's got the 13 choke points in the world, many of which are in and around China, and their ability to use their, militia, navy, so the maritime militia, to just deflect shipping, to make it. And they have not yet used their advantage that they've invested in these ports across the globe, that they could force those ports potentially to work against the U.S. interest. So I think this is all just playing out, and it's accelerating, and I think it's gaining more and more momentum as U.S. capital is flowing to this. It's being driven in no small part by the data center and AI, the national security elements of that, but just the fact that you need that, they need electricity. So I think this whole theme of kind of vertically integrated nations is playing out. We are going to work with our close allies to get some of it. We're going to do some of our own, and every country is going to do a little bit of that. And that's an investing thesis that I think we have to play with. And I have to say, in the last 4 or 5 months, as we're going through this, the number of our gig members who are on boards of these sorts of companies, because those companies understand the importance of national security, is outstanding. And I think that will just continue. I think we've seen a shift, and there's no going back. And to me, it doesn't even matter what happens in the midterms or the next presidential election. This is a shift that's, Biden did the CHIPS Act, so it's not new to Biden. Biden put tariffs on solar. So this is gaining bipartisan, and it's really part of that national strategic competition with China. And sorry if I drone on, but I am very passionate that I think this is the way of the future.
Absolutely, Peter. Thank you so much. And, Sarah, Trey, Peter, Maria, always great to see all of you. So thank you so much for your time today. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for your support. We'll keep you posted on all the developments that we talked about today in our upcoming T reports around the world, sit reps, and of course, in-person virtual engagement, which we very much appreciate. So again, we're looking forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to this conversation, and thank you to our listeners as well. Academy Securities is a service-disabled, veteran-owned investment bank with a social mission to hire, mentor, and train military veterans to develop careers in finance. If you would like to engage with our geopolitical intelligence group directly, then please email us at info@academysecurities.com. I've been your host, Nicholas Carpenito, and we look forward to sharing with you again soon.